listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
Welcome to another edition of the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. I'm your host, Femi Abebefe. As always, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Our producer, Elliot Bowman, with us on the ones and twos. Hope everyone had a happy and healthy 4th of July. It's fun to be back here. I was back in Chicago, went to visit there, went back to Minnesota, hanging out on the lake. Michael, I'm sure you had a very fun 4th of July as well. But how we doing, man? This is a fun day to be back at it here, and we got some stuff to talk about.
We're good, yeah, and then, we're in July, and we know that we're week 22 of the offseason, but we are going to have football here soon, I think 2 weeks away. What are we, July the 8th today? Yep. So, in another 2 weeks, most every team will be in training camp, and we'll be off into the races. We'll start this going, but it's good. 4th of July is always a great time at the Jersey Shore, and it's, it's a time to kind of revive yourself and get ready for a long season. So it's good to have you back. I mean, I picture you up in Minnesota like with the grumpy old men in the summertime, just going in those lakes, fishing, taking your car to the diner, having breakfast. I love it. It's been good.
We leave the fishing to the kids.
Have you seen that movie? Have you ever watched that movie? Have you watched that movie?
I have not seen that, but I did. I was hanging out on the lake. We left the fishing to the kids. They were out there fishing for sunnies and walleye and all sorts of stuff out there on the lake. But I was hanging out on the pontoon, got into water, did a little bit of swimming. It's not as hot as it is here in Las Vegas. Boy, Michael, I was welcome back to 120-degree weather. That was fun. Getting off the plane last night, I was like, holy hell, this thing is a lot here. But it was a lot of fun hanging out there. It's hanging out with my father-in-law and obviously my wife's side of the family and all that. They have a cabin up in Minnesota. They've had one for quite some time. So every 4th of July, we go up there and we spend some fun. And then Chicago was a great. Went to Wrigley Field. Had never been before. And when I saw a Cubs game,
nice.
they won.
Saw Doc Rivers at a restaurant.
Yeah,
saw Doc Rivers at a restaurant.
we saw.
Asked them to come on the pod.
we saw Glenn. Glenn was at a restaurant Friday night. We went to a restaurant that was really nice in Chicago, just outside of downtown. But he was hanging out. Made the trip from Milwaukee to Chicago. It's a short trip, so it was a lot of fun to be out there. Did the architecture tour, so did that thing and saw all the fun buildings and the architecture of the city of Chicago. So it was a lot of fun, but it's good to be back, though, watching some football. We flew Southwest on the way back. There's no in-flight entertainment, so I had it downloaded on my HBO Max, Michael. Hard Knocks, New York Giants, Offseason. Yeah. This was some good in-flight entertainment for me. I caught up on it. I want to get your thoughts on this first year because this was they highlight, we'd never seen a Hard Knocks like this before. They've done the in-season. Obviously, the training camp version of it is the original version of Hard Knocks, but this was highlighting the front office perspective, and general manager Joe Shane was obviously the main character of this first episode. We look forward to episode 2 tomorrow night, but I thought that this was really interesting. I want to get your thoughts as being someone who's been in that position.
Well, I think it was fascinating, and I think for football fans, it's a portrait into what should go on in the offseason. For me, and again, I'm not saying this from a negative standpoint or being critical of Joe Shane or any of that, but to me, when you watch this, you understand why the Giants have struggled. And the Giants are a founding franchise, and I say this with great respect to them. They are a franchise that has been the cornerstone when they're good. Now, they have been bad. When I was in college, they were horrible. Before George Young arrived, the 5 years before George Young arrived, their win percentage was 29%. And George Young was hired because Wellington Mara and the families were having a dispute. And the Commissioner Rozelle said, okay, we're going to hire George Young. He'll settle the dispute. But what George Young did besides settle the dispute is he gave the team leadership. So what I think you see in this first part is you see an example of one of the things that I've always wanted to do a podcast on, and this is going to give me the opportunity to do it, is there's a great podcast called How I Built This. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to do a podcast called How I Destroyed This. And I think this is not a sense of we're going to destroy the Giants, but I think this is a really portrait into why once proud franchises are not the same. And I think you could see it very clearly. So let's start with George Young. George Young comes in. He had been in Baltimore. He was with the Miami Dolphins. He comes in and he is basically a leader. He comes in with a series of he is going to give the Giants an identity by his grading system, by what he believes the way football should be played. So what I think you see in this video is what you see in the series is you see more of management. So one of the things we learned in leadership is management has a lot to do with finding answers. Leadership has a lot to do with asking the right questions. And the number one question any great leader is, and this is not exemplified in this by Joe Shane or anyone at the Giants, is who do we intend to be? See, when George came in, they intended to be a size speed team that could control the middle of the field, that was going to be physical more than anybody. It was not dependent on any assistant coach. It was dependent on they defined the Giant model. Okay? Mm-hmm. That's the philosophy of who they were by George Young. And they set out on that philosophy. That's what they did. And, and so they built that team around what he wanted. And there was never a question of this or that. There was never a line item. It always went back to, does this fit the philosophy of who we are? Who do we intend to be? And I got to say this, and I'd love to hear your commentary. I never got who they intend to be other than they're picking players.
Yeah, I mean, that was the interesting part when they hired Shane Bowen from Tennessee to become over to be the defensive coordinator. And I found it fascinating because I wanted to get your thoughts on, like, is this what typically happens when a new coach is brought in? Is it like, hey, like, tell us what kind of players fit your system? What do you want to do? Because it almost feels like what you're saying with George Young and that they did, like the good organizations do, is say, here's the players we want, size, speed, and the coaches come in and work with that. It's not really, hey, coach, what do you want? Yeah. Oh, you want a small player? Okay, we'll get a small player for you. Like, it felt like they were kind of like picking his brain to then go out there and do the grocery shopping and say, hey, all right, now we got your players. Now go ahead and cook the meal.
Right. So, see, you just hit the nail on the head. Philosophically, there is no philosophy. I think Tim McDonald's asked the question when he said, who are we if we lose Saquon? What's our identity? That's somebody who has actually grown up around an identity because he's part of the Mara family. He understands that. John Mara, who runs the team, has kind of let these other people come in, and what's happening is there's no philosophical nature within the company. There is no giant player. Everything is line item. We're going to evaluate on a course. And so they have a sign about defense, and the defensive chant started at Yankee Stadium. Well, they bring Shane Bowen in to basically describe who they're going to be on defense. Mm-hmm. That's the first sign that you're never going to win. Because now you're predicated based on the assistant coach. Yep. He leaves to take another job. Where are we? Well, we have to promote from within. Okay, now we get watered down. See, this is what's happened is they've not reinvented themselves. It's the same thing that happened to Firestone. It's the same thing that happened to Laura Ashley, the clothing manufacturers. What happens is they get into these things where they think they're keeping the philosophy the same, and yet they're allowing more people who don't understand the philosophy to come in. And then they can't teach and develop the philosophy from within. So Ed Smith, who we've had on the pod before, wrote the book Making Decisions. He just wrote something in New Statesman that applies to this. And he talks about how when you have organizations, there's accountability and responsibility. And sometimes people that are in the organization for long periods of time, Kevin Abrams has been there a long time. Tim McDonald's been there a long time. They have accountability to do their jobs. But since they've been able to withstand the wins and losses, they don't have responsibility to the losses. And so you have this conflict within it. And you have a lot of people that have been grandfathered in. They are accountable, but they're not responsible. And until you merge the two together, you can't have a constructive organization. You can't blend it together. And you could see this very clearly. So they're sitting in that room. There's 7 people, and they're discussing what they're going to do with Saquon Barkley. And they're basically, I think the only guy that made any sense in the room besides McDonald when he asked what's our identity was the guy, the pro personnel guy. I think, what's his name, Nick Latesta? Mm-hmm. He said, what are we going well, don't we think somebody's going to sign him? I mean, they all sat in there like nobody was going to sign him. Meanwhile, 60 miles down the road, they're chomping at the bit to sign him. Like, where's the awareness of your own company, right? Like, I think to me, and then this goes back to who are we philosophically? A year ago, they franchised him. A year ago, they signed Daniel Jones because they won 9 games. This year, they're not going to sign him. They can't afford him. But they could afford him last year. Like, how does this make any sense to you, Femi? And the only way it makes sense is basically what you're doing is you're taking every situation as it comes as opposed to having a philosophy to understand what we're doing.
Yeah, and I do want to play this cut from the HBO Hard Knocks, the offseason New York Giants. It's Joe Schoen, the general manager, and John Mara discussing this Saquon Barkley situation. Schoen's kind of mapping out how they're going to go about this from a plan standpoint of, hey, here's what we're going to tell them. But here's the cut from HBO's Hard Knocks.
Hey, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to let you hit free agency, find out your market, come back, and let us know if we can match it. If we can, we'll have those discussions.
I mean, in a perfect world, I'd still like to have him back. Until we can prove that we can have a decent offense without him.
Daniel's making a lot of money, and it's the fork. Like, we got to figure out is he the guy? So we got to protect him.
So yeah, those two voices, Joe Schoen and John Mara. And John Mara saying, hey, I would like to have him back in a perfect world. And they brought him back a season ago, like you mentioned, but this year they said we can't do it anymore. And Joe Schoen saying, we're paying our quarterback too much money to be paying the running back that much as well.
Well, but here's what I think Joe's completely wrong. Every quarterback needs to be managed. There's like no quarter, like you're not putting, like I've killed Daniel Jones. Mm-hmm. But if I were the general manager of the New York Football Giants, I wouldn't be sitting there saying, we got to put the game on his shoulders. Hell with that. I'm not doing that. Nope. You got to take every quarterback with the exception of Mahomes. Now, I completely disagree. If Mahomes was playing behind their offensive line, he would get rid of the ball quicker than Daniel. Like, that's a horrible analysis. Great quarterback. Brady's won Super Bowls with bad lines. And we'll pick this up after the break. But to me, there's so much meat on that bone there in this conversation that I just think so much of it's wrong.
Yeah, they're putting together a draftnik team, maybe, is what they're doing with the New York Giants. And, hey, so far it hasn't worked out too well after they went to the playoffs a couple of years ago. We'll pick up this conversation. We'll play another bite from the HBO Hard Knocks there. Off-season with the New York Giants is juicy stuff here. We're getting it rolling. Let's take a quick break, though. This is the GM Show.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
You mentioned it in the last segment. There's a lot of meat still left on the bone here, breaking down the first episode of the New York Giants off-season Hard Knocks. HBO did a terrific job putting this together. Episode 2 coming up Tuesday night. Can't wait to see what that one has in store for us. But it's interesting because Joe Schoen said we cannot pay Saquon Barkley $12 million since we're already paying Daniel Jones $40 million. But you mentioned 60 miles up the road, the Philadelphia Eagles paying Jalen Hurts $51 million ended up signing Saquon Barkley to that $12 million contract. And I guess, how do those two things kind of work together here? Because the Eagles were able to get it done. The Giants, though, didn't think that they could do it with Daniel Jones making $40 million on their books.
Well, I think to me, the Giants are all about that. They talk a game and then they really aren't. They don't have an identity. And so it all comes back to that. So they're basically evaluating each player as it stands alone, right? Like they're sitting in the room saying, well, we can get another back for cheaper. Where's the philosophy on what we're going to be offensively? Like, who are we? Like that question should never come up. Like, either, like in New England, Belichick was going to always bring another running back in from the draft. That was the philosophical belief, unless you can get a deal on the guy. They're talking about improving the offensive line. Shit, they've drafted 4 offensive linemen since Shane's been there. Now, I know they paid for some guys in free agency, but if you're committed to the offensive line, I know you drafted Neal in the first round, but you're going to put in this Schmidt in the second, but you're going to put a lot of resources into it. Like you're not coming out of the 23 draft with no offensive linemen, none. I mean, you drafted 2 receivers in the top 3 picks in the last 2 years. You drafted Neighbors, you drafted Hyatt. Like, there's no – see, here's what happens. When you're lost at sea, what do you need? You need a compass. You need somebody who has direction. When you're a football team and you have a 26% winning percentage since Tom Coughlin left, who was the compass for them because he goes back to the Young era. He was their compass. He could direct them to where they needed to go. But now since he's gone, they've been on this line item, bring this guy in, bring that guy in, and they don't have a compass. When you have a philosophy, you have a compass. This is who we are. We're devoted to offensive and defensive linemen. We're going to draft them. The Eagles have a compass, so they've added an auxiliary piece into Saquon Barkley. But they fit them in. But their compass is we're going to put money in offensive and defensive linemen. That's who they are. They have no linebackers. I mean, they signed Devin White, who stink. I mean, they don't give a shit. Zach Braun, they don't care. That's who they are. But there's nobody that's telling me who the Giants are. And that what makes it sad, and again, I'm not a Giant hater. I respect the shit out of the Giants because I learned a lot from the Giants. I learned from Belichick. I learned from Parcells. I've learned from them. And I've learned from Al Davis that you have to be who you want to be. You're nothing. You don't have an identity. They're talking about Darren Waller like he was coming back. Everybody in the world knows Darren Waller was never coming back, that he doesn't want to play football. I mean, everybody, that's why the Raiders traded him. He's great in the spring when there's no contact. When there's contact, it's over. Like there was no awareness. Oh, nobody's going to sign Barkley. The difference between Barkley and the next guy. Meanwhile, what happened in free agency? There was a run of backs. Mm-hmm. When you have an identity and you have a compass, this is who we are. Like if I was in that meeting, I would have said, fellas, we're the New York Football Giants. We're going to build through offensive and defensive linemen. That's who we are. We invented it. We invented the role. We invented size, speed. This is who we are. We're going to out-physical people. We're tougher than everybody. We're not playing small ball. They're going to have to adapt to us. We're going to build a team around the quarterback, and we're going to make sure that he can maximize his skill set. We're not going to sit there and say, well, Mahomes couldn't play behind this line. Well, shit, you've been on the job for 2 years. You didn't think the line was shitty when you got there?
Yeah. To me, it continues to go back to this Daniel Jones decision for me because, like he mentioned, we paid him $40 million. But as you've outlined throughout this offseason, Daniel Jones is taking up a significant amount of the cap in terms of percentage. Like, what is it, 22%, 23% of the cap that Daniel Jones is taking up?
They're in the top 5 of percentage of quarterbacks eating. He eats up 18%. The overall, counting Drew Lock, at 19%. I mean, the Cowboys are first, but the Cowboys have let Dak's contract go so far that they could easily redo it and lower his cap percentage, but they didn't. But again, Femi, it comes back to what I think John Mara has lost is, and I know he wants to get there. I just don't think he understands that it's about team building. Think about it. They've gone through since Coughlin, they've been on a 26% win percentage. They've had one playoff win. They had one 9-win season, right? And so they had the year where they went down to the boat with McAdoo and they got all, and Odell took the boat trip, all that. Yep. I mean, they've had periods of winning, but they haven't, in 10 years, they haven't won the East. Yeah. So my point here is this: they don't have a compass. And what George Young brought to them in '79. And everybody, and when Accorsi came in, he kept the compass. This is who we are. Accorsi, we're offensive linemen, defensive linemen. When they traded for the quarterback, he wouldn't trade Osi Umenoro because he wasn't going to give up a defensive lineman. That's what the Chargers wanted in that deal. That's who we are. But they've lost their way. Yeah, they got Dexter Lawrence. That's great. They drafted Thibodeau. Okay, they signed Brian Burns. Great. But their offense, but up until this point, where are they? Like, there's no identity to the team. And then they signed Singletary, and they play in the Northeast. Like Singletary, you better have a power back.
Yeah. And you think back to those teams that did win those Super Bowls, 2007, 2011, it was really good offensive line, really good defensive line, and they made some plays on the outside as well. But it started in the trenches with both of those teams that won Super Bowls recently here. But I do want to, we'll hit on the Brian Burns thing because I thought that was interesting, the conversation between Joe Shane and Dan Morgan at the Senior Bowl down there in Mobile. But the point that he brought up about Daniel Jones, you've kind of alluded to it about, hey, our offensive line is pretty bad. But I think it's the second half of this clip here that we're about to play from HBO's Hard Knocks that I think is the real more fascinating part about what Joe Shane thinks about his quarterback.
The reality is facts.
Yeah.
3 serious injuries in 2 years.
Yeah.
We need to protect ourselves. He didn't have much of a chance this year. That's legit. Nobody could. You could have Pat Mahomes and he can't win it behind that. I'm not giving up on he's under contract for 3 more years. Just protecting ourselves because best predictor of the future is the past.
He says, I'm not giving up on Daniel Jones. It says just protecting ourselves, best predictor of the future is the past, which to me, like, that is why I think they went out and brought in Russell Wilson and did some work on the quarterbacks in the draft. Is they're kind of thinking that, hey, either there's a durability issue that's going on here, or we just can't continue to go down this road. But then he at the same time says, I'm not giving up on Daniel Jones. It's like, I don't think you can with the way the contract is structured.
Well, I mean, like, look, I don't understand, like, how did we get here? Like, part of understanding how to fix things is how do we get here? Last year, we paid Daniel Jones, and then we franchised Barkley. Like, and we were trying to sign Barkley to a long-term deal last year that he kept turning down. Well, say he takes that deal, where would we be now? Like, where was this conversation last year? Like, why is this a new conversation today? And look, I just think, to me, there's no compass. Like, again, I'm sure Joe seems like a hell of a guy, but I think the difference between Joe and what George Young brought to them in terms of both general managers was George Young had a vision. He was a leader. He walked in the building and said, this is who we are. This is what we're going to be. And he got everybody to buy into it. And everybody understood who a Giant player was. I knew, working at the 49ers, what a Giants player was. They had a grading system. I learned it. We were Tom Boyster and Tony Rossano were best friends. So I knew everything that was going on. Like, and then they kicked our ass on a cold day in January, 49-3. And we went home and licked our wounds and said, they're way too physical for us. They're way stronger than we are. They're bigger, tougher, faster. And they had an identity, but they don't have one now. They've lost their way, and they don't have nobody who can give them a compass. You know, Shane Bowen's in there telling them what they want. They invented what you want. Like, when you're talking about talent acquisition, you have to define each job, specific and detailed. You have to scout inside out. You have to eliminate more than finding. And what should have happened in that meeting is Joe Shane should have stood in there and Shane Bowen and said, hey, Joe, Shane, this is what we're playing with at right end. This is what the Giants want, a defensive tackle. Now, you got to figure out how it works for you, but that's what we want. But they're sitting there looking at the chart. Well, look at this run defense that Shane Bowen had last year. Well, of course, they had fucking Jeffrey Simmons over there. I mean, they're in an 8-man front all the time. Like, you can't go stat to stat. Hey, if you can give me that run defense, I'm going to be happy. Bullshit. Like, that's all different. Like, when has Shane Bowen run the New York Football Giants? Like, that's appalling to me. It's appalling to me. Like, that's just everything that's wrong with football. That's why teams lose. It's because you have some assistant coach, and he may be a brilliant assistant coach. Now, as Al Davis would say, he's playing general manager.
Yep.
He's the general manager.
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of startling to me. That's why I wanted to get your thoughts on it and wondering if that's what happens in other places as well. Because I was like, man, there's like Shane Bowen's out here running the show, essentially, for what he wants on defense here. The Brian Burns thing, though, I thought was really interesting. Like, Dan Morgan and Joe Shane, they had a pass together. They're best of friends is what it sounded like. They go on vacations together with their families. I thought it was a little strange on Dan Morgan's part to just say, hey, like, you want to give us 2 1s for Burns, or do you want to 1 in something? It's like, is that how negotiating goes in these early preliminary talks? Like, it seemed like a weird sort of setup. Like, he was just pretty much just offering, saying, hey, he's available, which I'm sure they had some sort of idea.
He was negotiating against himself.
Yeah,
he was negotiating against himself. I mean, the best thing you could do in negotiation is say, no, we're not trading him. If Morgan says, no, we're not trading him, but he was floating out there. That's a whole other thing. I mean, we could get into that. I mean, we saw the Tepper's wife. She's telling Dan Morgan in the draft who she likes. I mean, so, I don't need to go down that road any further than that. I mean, look, I just think, to me, when you are aligned as an organization, when you're competing against the best of the best, you're scouting inside out. You have an identity for every single player. Nobody comes from the outside to tell you what they want. You tell them this is the kind of player. You think somebody told Bill Parcells when he was the defensive coordinator, hey, this is the kind of defense we want, or Belichick? They had Lawrence Taylor. They played 34. Now, that's not saying they didn't improvise within the framework, but when Belichick came to Cleveland, he wanted big guys. That's what he wanted. He wanted to build an identity. They don't have one. I don't care what you say to me. This is not about me. This is about them.
Yeah. It seemed like it was a little bit of aimless, blind leading the blind for the New York Giants, but we'll see what the rest of the Hard Knocks has in store. But that does it for us here on the DraftKings Network. On the other side, I did want to get some of your thoughts, Michael, because we saw a lot happen in the NBA world. We'll get your thoughts on your 76ers. They got Paul George. He's back in Philadelphia. We'll discuss it next year on the GM Show.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
All right, little bonus action because this is a general manager and decision-making podcast. We wanted to talk some NBA free agency and what we saw over this past week. And look at your Philadelphia 76ers, Michael. They go ahead and they sign Tyrese Maxey, gets 5 years, $204 million extension, but the big coup in free agency this year, the headliner, Paul George, going from the Clippers to the Sixers, 4 years, $212 million. As Morey and the Sixers, I guess, kind of zigging while others zag, since a lot of teams are breaking up these big threes and they're diving right into it with now Embiid, George, and Maxey out there in the city of brotherly love.
Well, I mean, look, Morey has a philosophy. And it's nothing about culture or team building. It's all about, I want 3 players that are in the top 30. You got Embiid, who's a top 10 player if healthy. You have Paul George, who's probably a top 20 player if healthy. And then you have Maxey, who's probably a top 30 player if healthy. So, you have all those things going for you. And, and he's got to hope that Embiid, I mean, his biggest thing, he's got to hope Embiid is healthy in March and April. This whole nonsense, well, we're going to wait and see about, we're going to make sure they're rested and load management and all that. I mean, by the way, Bronny has already had load management already. He missed the second Summer League game because of a little soreness of his knee. Can you imagine that? Guy scored 4 points, 2 for 9 shooting, but we're going to keep promoting him on the worldwide leader because God forbid if we don't. I mean, God forbid if we don't.
The slow time of year.
Poor kid. I mean, I feel so bad for that kid. I mean, that's just so unfair. It's so unfair. But anyway, I mean, they got to count on that. But I think to me, when you look at the Sixers and you look at the Celtics, the competitors, you see a difference. You see team building in Boston. You see random player selection in Philadelphia. That's what you see. There's no team building going on in Philly. It's about adding pieces. It's the same thing at the Giants. There's no identity of Philadelphia. Whereas in Boston, there is an identity. They want self-aware players. They want to be switchable on defense. They want this, and this. And they have a sustainable model that can go on. I mean, they just re-signed players. Now they're going to have to pay the threshold and all that crap. But for me, I think it's really kind of it's just too different. It's again, one team is picking players, another team has a philosophical belief, and you see the same thing in Oklahoma City. They have a philosophical belief through the draft, through how they add pieces and what they want. It's really not complicated how to win in sports, how to become a champion. You have to have that, but it's hard to do because what people misconstrue is the act of player selection, adding talent as it relates to the team doesn't always go hand in hand. I mean, the Giants talk about, well, we want to be an offensive line. They'd been drafting receivers. Could you remember they drafted Tony in the first round? That was what, 3 years ago? I mean, they drafted Neighbors in the first round. They drafted Hyatt. I mean, who are we? We used to be the model of offensive and defensive linemen. Now we're not anymore. So my hopes aren't up because I think, to me, this is all predicated on a very shaky foundation of Embiid staying healthy.
100%. And I think that was my big takeaway when I saw the trade. I was like, if you're playing a video game, this is really exciting, when you can turn injuries off and it's those guys all fully healthy. But, I mean, everything, like the conversation with the Philadelphia 76ers will always start with, will Embiid be able to make it through an entire postseason? And we haven't seen that in quite some time. Since the Kawhi Leonard shot, that was the last time he was healthy, quote unquote, in a playoffs. And that was a long time ago. So, as good as Paul George is, and Paul George also has health questions himself in his latter portion of his career. He's not guaranteed to stay healthy. Maxey's the guy that you can kind of hang your hat on as being a really good player that should be healthy come postseason time. But it feels like this could be a house of cards sort of situation. And I think the point that you brought up that I think was my big takeaway from honestly just doing this podcast with you has been really you get out of the, hey, we're in the talent acquisition model and we're in the talent acquisition industry, and it's no, you're actually in the team building industry. You're still trying to build a team. You have to acquire talent to build a team, but you always need to focus on how does this fit together, what's our philosophy versus let's just get a bunch of talent and then figure it out. But I feel like that's kind of what the Sixers are sort of doing there.
Yeah. And then it becomes the coach's fault if it doesn't work out. I mean, like it's going to be Brian Daboll's fault if it doesn't work out, even though they have no idea that they're not team building. They're not team building at all. They're just adding pieces. Oh, we need a better right guard, or we need a better point guard, or we need a better this. And then all of a sudden, when it starts to fall apart, they can't fix it because they don't really understand how it was constructed. Mm-hmm. Whereas when the Giants, they come in, they draft Phil Simms, they draft offensive linemen, they build this team, they get Parcells, he comes in there. That's why That's why they got that sign up. Why we lift all them weights. I mean, there was a clear philosophy, and there was nobody. Trust me, when I grew up in scouting, there was nobody who didn't know who the Giants were. And they could care less about eliminating a player here or a player there. They knew exactly who they were and what they wanted, but they don't have that anymore. And I'm sure, Chris Mara probably sees it as opposed to some, the guys that have been back there in the past. And a lot of it comes down to a misevaluation too, right? You misevaluate a player. We're all going to misevaluate a player.
Yep.
But to think that Daniel Jones doesn't need his great supporting cast around him, no quarterback in the league other than Mahomes carries their team. Justin Herbert needs a supporting cast. He's making $52 million a year. Like, they all need it. Like, it's a ridiculous line to say we can't pay Barkley. We'll get Devin Singletary to come in here and do that. Okay, great. Singletary looked good last year for this. Okay, I had him in Buffalo. Great. I get that. But Barkley was the guy that, you don't think you're going to get a bunch of eight-man fronts? Like, they're going to take Neighbors out of the game and say, okay, Daniel, where are you throwing the football? They need if they had a back there that you've put fear into you. I'm not saying that look, to me, you know how I feel about running backs, but to me, it all comes back to who are we?
Yeah.
Again, remember, championship teams, they ask the question, who are we? Managers, this sums up the thing when you watch the Hard Knocks, when you watch the 76ers. Managers do things right, leaders do the right thing. That's what it comes down to. And so, the other thing I found interesting too, Femi, I was looking at some of the summer leagues. Somebody sent me this too, and it kind of just dawned on me. Why is J.J. Redick not coaching in the summer league?
I thought that he might.
This guy's never coached before. No, he's not coaching. He's watching.
Yeah. That's.
What is that? You need all the reps you can get, JJ. Like, you need all the communication you can work on. Like, what the hell are you doing? Like, when did you – Nick Nurse coached the 76ers Summer League last year. Guys coach Summer League. You need – you're sitting there telling the players you need to improve. Meanwhile, you've never coached before. You don't need to improve?
Yeah.
I just find it – there's so many things that you look at when you sit back and watch it. Like, if John Mara hired an outside consultant to come in and look at his organization and say, what do we need to do? They would come back and say – you have no idea. You don't even know who you are. You have no idea who you are.
Which is unfortunate for one of the pillar franchises in the NBA. I guess J.J. Redick, maybe he's waiting to get that reservation at Delilah's. Maybe that's
he doesn't know who he is either.
He's busy. He can't do the summer league coaching. I can't wait to see him next week in summer league here in Las Vegas. That'll be a whole lot of fun. Last NBA question for you. Are you going to miss Tobias Harris?
Tobias made over $300 million in his career. The guy's worked hard. He shows up every week. It's not his fault that he disappears. And I think, to me, I like Caleb Martin. I thought that was a good signing. At least he'll play defense. Look, but to me, this is all on Nick Nurse. How do all these pieces fit? See, I think the biggest misconception is they keep saying, all these people say, well, the 76ers need spacing. They need spacing. Yeah, that's true. If Embiid would ever get his ass in the low post, they need spacing. But when he's playing out there in the three-point line, how do you have spacing with that?
Yeah, he's a small forward. He's pretty good at it,
exactly.
but he doesn't stay healthy, and we see that stuff come up every time in the postseason. Before we get out of here and wrap up this pod, though, obviously sad news over the weekend in the National Football League. Minnesota Vikings rookie Kyrie Jackson killed in an auto accident. It was Kyrie Jackson and a couple of his teammates from high school, one of which played at Maryland and UNC Charlotte. Another one was a Penn State player, but just incredibly sad. Like 24, 23, 24 years old, these guys. The car was sideswiped there by a driver driving a little bit reckless, but obviously we'll learn more as the police report and all that stuff continues to come out, but just incredibly, incredibly sad news in the National Football League.
Yeah, really sad. This is your worst nightmare as a father. parent. You know, you lose a son, lose a daughter, you know, and as a general manager, you sit there until you can get everybody back to camp. You're just worried sick about, you know, everybody's behavior and everybody's ability to stay healthy. And our prayers are out to the families of all the victims. I mean, they had two other, Hazel and Litton, were involved. Anthony Litton was 23 years old, 24. Isaiah Hazel was 23. It's really sad. So our hearts are with them, and, you know, I feel bad for the Viking organization. But the Vikings, you know, I'm sure they're going to do what's right for the families and all that, because they are a first-class organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I saw, like, the University of Oregon, that's where Kyrie Jackson played. They put out, like, a tribute video for him and everything. And, yeah, it's like, I remember, like, watching this kid play, because I watched a lot of Oregon football this past year and stuff like that, and, like, watching him, like, he's like, oh, this is, like, this big, rangy corner. That was kind of an interesting player and stuff like that. And obviously, that doesn't matter as much. Obviously, the life is much more important. But, you know, it's like these kids are just, they're so young, you know. And, like, yeah, he's a young man at 24, but it's an unfortunate situation. It's a situation that could happen to anybody, honestly. If you're just driving on the highway and all of a sudden somebody sideswipes you, it's really difficult.
Yeah,
so obviously, yeah, horrible news there. Our thoughts definitely with the Minnesota Vikings and Kyrie Jackson, his family and friends, and everybody else lost the family and friends of Litton and Hazel as well. We hate to end it on a sad news, but we wanted to make sure we just gave out those sentiments as well here on the GM Shuffle, since that was news that broke over the weekend while we were gone. But that does it for this edition of the podcast. We'll be back with you guys on Thursday. I know people have been clamoring for it, Michael. They've been tweeting at us. Blue Chips, Red Chips returns. And we're starting with the DBs, so that's an exciting time for us here. It's kind of the official kickoff to training camp for us here on the GM Shuffle podcast. As, hey, we got 3 weeks from now, we're going to have the Hall of Fame game, Bears and Texans, and we'll have football on our TVs. And, yes, it's not going to be the football that we see in the fall, but it'll be football nonetheless, and we'll be consuming it, we'll be watching it, we'll be analyzing it, and it'll be a lot of fun. But Blue Chips, Red Chips begins on Thursday, and we'll continue all the way out through training camp. And before you know it, we'll be here for kickoff, less than 60 days away of the 2024 NFL regular season. But as always, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Thank you to our producer, Elliot Bowman, with us on the ones and twos. Michael, I'll talk to you Thursday, man.
Thank you, Femi.